Why did Portugal spend generations searching across Africa for a kingdom Europeans believed could change the balance of world history? And why did old European maps later place a mysterious name resembling Judah along the West African coast? This is not simply a story about an old map. It is a story about a medieval legend, African kingdoms, Portuguese exploration, Jewish history, and the dangerous way a name can become something completely different when it crosses languages, continents, and centuries. For generations, European rulers and explorers believed there was a powerful Christian ruler somewhere beyond the known world. His name was Prester John. The legend described him as the ruler of a wealthy Christian kingdom surrounded by Muslim powers. For Europeans living during an age of religious conflict, the possibility of finding such a ruler was enormous. Imagine discovering a powerful Christian kingdom on the other side of the world. Imagine finding an ally who could help Europe confront its enemies from another direction. It sounded almost impossible, but Portugal took the search seriously. During the 15th century, Portuguese explorers began pushing farther down the African coast. They were searching for gold. They were searching for trade routes. They were searching for access to the Indian Ocean. But they were also searching for information about Prester John. And eventually, their search led them to one of the most remarkable Christian civilizations in Africa, Ethiopia. By the late 15th century, Portuguese explorers had begun establishing contact with the Ethiopian Christian kingdom. In 1487, Pero de Covilhã and Afonso de Paiva were sent on a mission connected to the search for Prester John. Covilhã eventually reached Ethiopia, and suddenly the European legend appeared to have a real location. But there was a problem. The kingdom was real. The Christian ruler was real. But this was not the mythical empire Europeans had imagined. It was Ethiopia, an ancient African civilization with its own history, rulers, religious traditions, languages, and political struggles. The Europeans had not discovered a fantasy kingdom. They had encountered a real African civilization that existed independently of European expectations. And Portugal became deeply involved. In the 16th century, Portuguese forces eventually fought alongside Ethiopian forces against the armies of the Adal Sultanate. A medieval European legend had helped lead Portugal into a real African geopolitical struggle. But then, another mystery begins to appear. This time, it wasn't in Ethiopia. It was on the western side of Africa. European maps began showing a place with names such as Judah, Ajuda, Wida, or Uida. And to a modern reader, one of those names immediately raises a question. Judah. Was this evidence of the biblical kingdom of Judah in Africa? That is where we have to slow down, because the answer is not as simple as the map might make it appear. The modern city of Wida is in present-day Benin. The region was historically associated with the Hoida or Ixweda people and their kingdom. European traders recorded the name in different forms. Portuguese sources used Ajuda. Other European languages produced forms such as Wida and Oida. And this matters because historical names are not fixed. They change when people pronounce them. They change when merchants write them down. They change when explorers translate them. And they change again when cartographers copy older maps. So when a European map displays a name that looks like Judah, we cannot automatically conclude that the map maker was claiming to have discovered the biblical kingdom of Judah. A similar-looking name is not the same thing as genealogical proof. A place name is not DNA, and a map label is not an archaeological excavation. But that doesn't make the story less interesting. It makes it more interesting, because now the real mystery becomes, why did this West African place acquire a name that could look so biblical to later readers? And what happened when European exploration, African kingdoms, Christian legends, Jewish history, and Atlantic trade began overlapping? To understand that, we have to step into the world of the Portuguese Atlantic. Portugal was not simply exploring Africa. It was building networks. Ships moved along the coastline. Merchants established relationships with African rulers. Missionaries followed trade routes. European cartographers collected information, and enormous amounts of wealth began moving through Atlantic ports. Ouidah eventually became one of the important centers connected to the Atlantic slave trade. The Portuguese established the fort of São João Batista de Ajudá there. The name Ajudá itself became part of the European record. And once again, we see how a local African name entered European maps and documents. But there is another connection that makes this story even more complicated. Jewish history really did intersect with Portuguese history in Africa. Following the persecution, expulsion and forced conversion of Jews in Iberia, Sephardic Jewish merchants and families became part of commercial networks stretching across Europe, North Africa, the Caribbean, and West Africa. Research into Portuguese Sephardic communities documents Jewish and Luso-African networks along the West African coast. So now we have several different historical threads crossing the same Atlantic world. Portuguese explorers, African kingdoms, Christian Ethiopia, Sephardic merchants, Atlantic trade, and European maps. It would be tempting to connect all of these things into one hidden story. But history is rarely that simple. And this is where your ancestry matters, because one of the biggest mistakes people make when researching family history is assuming that similar names automatically mean shared ancestry. They don't. Two families can have similar surnames and completely different origins. Two places can have almost identical names and completely different histories. And two populations can share cultural influences without being descended from the same ancient people. This is exactly why modern DNA research has changed ancestry research. DNA can provide biological evidence of relationships between populations. Historical documents can tell us where people lived. Archaeology can reveal physical evidence. Language can preserve traces of migration, and place names can preserve memories of people and events. But none of these pieces should automatically replace the others. They have to be compared. Imagine standing inside a European mapmaker's workshop hundreds of years ago. A huge map of Africa is spread across a wooden table. Much of the continent is still poorly understood by Europeans. The coastline is becoming clearer because sailors have traveled it. But the interior remains filled with uncertainty. The mapmaker is working from reports brought back by merchants, missionaries, sailors, and explorers. Some information is accurate, some is misunderstood, some has been copied from older maps. And then you see the name, Judah or Ajudah. To the modern eye, it looks like a biblical clue. But to the people living in that region, it represented something connected to their own local history. That is the difference between a historical mystery and a historical conclusion. The mystery is real, the conclusion still needs evidence. Here's the twist that changes the entire story. The strongest mystery isn't that Portugal discovered the biblical kingdom of Judah in West Africa. There is no solid evidence establishing that. The stronger story is that European exploration created a world where African names, biblical traditions, Portuguese language, Jewish migration, Christian legends, and European cartography began interacting in ways that can still confuse us centuries later. Portugal went looking for Prester John. They found Ethiopia. They were looking for trade. They encountered African kingdoms. They were recording local names. Those names were transformed by European languages, and later generations looked at those maps through a completely different historical lens. Suddenly, a local African name could appear to contain a biblical secret, but perhaps the deeper lesson is that Africa did not need a biblical kingdom hidden inside it to have an extraordinary history. The kingdoms were already there. The trading systems were already there. The political alliances were already there. The cultures were already there. The Portuguese entered an African world that was already complex. They did not create that complexity. They documented pieces of it, sometimes accurately, sometimes imperfectly, and sometimes through names that would become almost unrecognizable after passing through several languages. That is why the word Judah on an old map is so powerful. Not because it proves a lost Israelite kingdom existed in West Africa. It doesn't. It is powerful because it reminds us how easily history can become distorted when names travel farther than their original context. A name can cross an ocean, a legend can cross a continent. A family can migrate thousands of miles. A religion can enter a completely different cultural environment. And centuries later, someone looking at the surviving evidence may see only fragments. This is also why ancestry is so much more complicated than a list of countries on a DNA test. Your ancestry is a story of movement. It is migration. It is marriage. It is survival. It is cultural exchange. It is sometimes forced movement. And it is sometimes the disappearance of records that once explained everything. That is one of the reasons I created the Bloodline Code. What your DNA reveals about ancestry, ancient origins, hidden traits, and human evolution. Because the deeper you investigate ancestry, the more you discover that DNA is only one piece of a much larger puzzle. A surname can provide a clue. A historical document can provide another. An old map can reveal what people believed at a particular moment. And DNA can tell you whether the biological evidence supports the story. But the real answers often appear only when these different forms of evidence begin pointing in the same direction. Portugal's search for Prester John eventually led Europeans to a real Christian kingdom in Africa. The name Ajuda became attached to a real West African place. Sephardic and Portuguese networks became part of West African history. And European maps preserved fragments of those encounters. None of this proves that the biblical kingdom of Judah was located in West Africa. But it does prove something perhaps even more important. The history of Africa was never a blank space waiting for Europeans to discover it. It was already filled with kingdoms, peoples, trade networks, migrations, languages, and stories. The Portuguese simply became one group of outsiders trying to understand a world that was much older and more complicated than their maps could show. And perhaps that is the question worth carrying forward. When you find a strange name on an ancient map, are you looking at evidence of a lost civilization? Or are you looking at the surviving footprint of a story that became transformed as it traveled? Because sometimes the greatest mystery isn't discovering where a lost kingdom went. It's discovering how much history was already there before someone else gave it a name.